Chapter 10. Chet rose to his knees and threw up. When he could stand, he staggered over to his clothes. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely button his shirt. He shoved his feet into his boots, not even trying to lace them. And then, on wobbly legs, his blood pounding in his ears, he ran up the hill and found his way to Main Street. He pushed past the ladies with their shopping baskets. He crossed the street, ignoring the honking motor car that swerved around him. A man in a buggy shouted at him to watch out. The horse whinnied. Chet barely noticed. He staggered into Mr. Colton's hardware store, tripping across the doorway and knocking over a display of watering cans. The clattering brought him 3 customers to the front of the store. Mr. Colton hurried out from behind the counter. "Chet," he said, worried. "What's wrong?" Chet opened his mouth, but he couldn't speak. "What happened?" Mr. Colton said. "Why is your shirt covered with blood? Are you bleeding? Who did this to you?" A small group of customers clustered around him, their eyes filled with concern. Finally, Chet got the words out. "A shark!" "What?" Mr. Colton said. "A shark!" Chet repeated. "Has there been another attack on the shore?" Mr. Colton said. "I didn't see anything in the newspaper." Chet shook his head. "There's a shark in the creek," he said. "I saw it. It crashed into me." The crowd erupted into laughter. Mr. Colton offered a sympathetic smile and a hand over his shoulder. It's the heat, my boy. It's driving us all a little mad." He asked one of the customers to go into the back and bring Chet a drink. He led Chet through the laughing crowd and sat him on the stool behind the counter. A man handed Chet a tin mug of water. "Take a drink, son," Mr. Colton said, but Chet pushed it away, and water splashed onto a pile of seed catalogs. "We have to warn people." But Mr. Colton shook his head like Chet was a little kid who wasn't sure he'd seen a unicorn galloping down the sidewalk. "There's so much garbage floating in that creek," Mr. Colton said. "It could have been a plank from the dock or a barrel or a—" "No," Chet said. "It was a shark." "I think maybe all those pranks are getting to you," Mr. Colton said. Chet knew that he must sound crazy, that he could spend all day swearing that he'd seen a shark. Nobody would believe him. Why would they? A shark in the creek? It was impossible, except that Chet had seen it with his own eyes. If he'd been a step slower, he'd be dead right now. Another name in the newspaper. "It's all right, son," Mr. Colton said. "How about I call Dr. J, and he'll give you a ride home? You've never been in his motor car, have you?" Mr. Colton headed to the back of the store to use the telephone. The customers drifted away, shaking their heads and chuckling. No, nobody would believe it. Meanwhile, that shark was still in the creek. And then it hit Chet that there was one person in town who might believe him, who might know what to do. He wasn't sure, but it was his best hope. He slid off the stool and rushed out of the store. "Chet," Mr. Colton called. "Where are you going?" Chet didn't turn around. He had to find Captain Wilson. He'd wasted enough time already. Chapter 11. Chet stood on the sagging porch of the captain's house. He barely knocked when the front door swung open. The captain stood there with a scowl on his crumpled up face. He looked at Chet like he'd never seen him before. "Yes," he said. "What is this about?" Chet's heart sank. He thought of what Uncle Jerry had said, that the captain's mind was like Swiss cheese, full of holes and gaps in his memory. "What is it?" the captain said. "Are you selling something? I don't have all day." "Sorry, sir," Chet said. "I didn't mean to bother you." He almost turned around and walked away, but he forced himself to stay put. He stepped forward, close to the captain, and peered right into his eyes. "Captain," he said in a loud voice, "I saw a shark in the creek. It crashed into me." Chet lifted his shirt to show the angry-looking scrape. The captain stared at Chet's chest. Then he looked into the distance. Did he even know where he was? I know it sounds impossible, sir. It doesn't make any sense at all. The captain looked back at Chet. Sure it does, he said. Chet's eyes widened in surprise. The creek empties out into the Raritan Bay, which leads right to the Atlantic. Pirates used to come up to these parts, buried their treasure all around here. The captain's eyes kept getting brighter. If the tides are high and the currents are strong, a shark could get swept right up into the creek. Of course it could. I saw it, Captain, Chet said, more confident now. It was huge. And its eyes, just like you said. Killer eyes? The captain muttered. Chet nodded. Why are you standing here, son? The captain scolded. We need to warn people. I'm getting my boat. You get down to that swimming hole. You tell people what you saw. What if they won't believe me? Chet asked. The captain put a hand on Chet's shoulder. His grip was very strong. Go, he said.